Lonely lumberjack paid 2 for woman with sack on her head at auction marries her when she says name. Oregon Territory. Spring of 1869. The gavel cracked like a bone breaking. In the dust-choked air of the Oregon Territory outpost, a makeshift auction block stood frail against a crowd of hard men. Their eyes were dull pits of hunger and whiskey, their hands callous from axes and reins, their hearts hollowed out by the unforgiving frontier. A man with a rusted deputy badge and a voice like grinding stones bellowed, "Last one for the day. She ain't got no name, ain't shown no face. Sack over the head since Missouri, but she can work and she'll obey. Starting bid, $2. Who's brave or drunk enough to marry the mystery?" A whip crack of laughter cut through the haze. "Maybe she's a witch under that thing," one man slurred. "Or a corpse," another added, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Might as well marry the damn sack." On the platform, she stood barefoot and still. A coarse burlap sack, stained with road grime and God knows what else, was cinched tight at her neck with fraying twine. Only the frantic, shallow rhythm of her breathing gave away the life beneath. Her bound fingers twitched, clenched, and released in a silent, desperate language. The crowd shifted, some turning away in disinterest, others staying for the cruel spot of it, nudging each other, waiting for the fool. Then, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. A man moved from the back, his silence more powerful than their noise. He was tall, with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke beneath a canvas coat. The brim of a worn black hat shadowed a face that seemed carved from the ancient timber he worked. His boots were heavy with mud, his axe handle wrapped in sweat-stained leather. He was a man who had spoken more to trees than to people. "Two," he said. The voice was low, a rumble from the chest, like stones settling deep in the earth. Not angry, not eager. Just certain. The snickering died. The auctioneer squinted, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "You sure, mister? You ain't even gonna look at what you're buying?" The tall man's gaze remained fixed on the motionless figure on the stage. "I ain't buying a face," he said, his voice dropping even lower, carrying across the sudden stillness. "I'm marrying a person." The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. No one laughed now. The auctioneer cleared his throat, scribbling on a scrap of paper. "Name," he muttered, eager to be done. "Silas Boone. Profession? Lumberman. North Ridge." The auctioneer shoved the paper at him. Silas signed his name, the letter stuck and clear. The lawman then turned to the woman. "You're legally wed, Mrs. State your name for the record." The sack shifted. A long moment passed, filled only by the buzzing of flies. Then a voice emerged, so soft it was almost stolen by the wind, muffled and trembling. "Annabelle. Annabelle Crow." Silas froze. The name meant nothing. But the voice, it was a ghost. His eyes, for a split second, widened with a look of raw shock before hardening again into a mass of granite. 3 winters ago. A blizzard that scraped the world clean. A frozen cave, the scent of pine bark tea, and a voice in the dark, pulling him back from the edge of death. A voice he'd never forgotten, from a woman whose face he'd never seen. He stepped onto the platform, his movements slow and deliberate. He gently took the woman's arm, his touch firm, a silent promise. "You're safe now." As they walked away, the crowd watched in stunned silence, leaving only the creak of boots on dry planks and the whisper of a name that had just unlocked the door to a bloody, frozen memory. The meal for the last one standing, the forest closed in around them, a cathedral of ancient pines that swallowed the trail and the fading light. The air grew cool, scented with damp earth and pine needles. Silas Boone walked a few paces ahead, leading the weary mule that carried their meager supplies. He did not look back. He did not speak. He moved with the quiet purpose of a man at home in the deep woods, his senses tuned to the snap of a twig, the call of a distant bird. Behind him, Annabel followed, a shadow in a sack. The silence between them was not empty, it was a heavy blanket woven from two different kinds of survival. They reached his cabin as dusk bled purple and orange across the sky. It was not large, but it was built to endure. Dark, tight-hewn logs, a stone chimney breathing a thin whiz of smoke, and a rusted horseshoe nailed over the doorframe for a luck it seemed had long since run out. Silas pushed the door open with a low groan of wood and stepped aside. "You pick where you stand," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "No one's gonna place you anymore." Annabel entered the small room with the caution of a fox testing the ice. Her bare feet made no sound on the smooth-worn floorboards. She didn't approach the small table or the single chair, but instead sank to the floor against the far wall, her back to the room, a huddled shape of fear. The sack remained firmly in place. Silas gave her the space she claimed. He moved with an easy, familiar rhythm, stoking the embers in the hearth, filling a kettle from a water barrel, his presence a steady, non-threatening hum in the quiet cabin. Soon, the scent of simmering broth, smoked meat, and a hint of wild onion filled the small space, a smell of life, of sustenance. He asked no questions. He gave no commands. When the stew was ready, he ladled it into two wooden bowls. He placed one on the floor near her, careful not to get too close. She flinched but did not turn. He then sat at the table with his own bowl, eating slowly. After several long minutes, her voice came, muffled and thin through the burlap. "Why two bowls?" Silas stirred his stew, his gaze on the swirling contents. "I call it a meal for the last one standing," he said. He gestured with his spoon toward the empty space across the table. "Used to make it for myself after long days in the woods. After the war, after my wife passed. I kept making two. A way of saying I made it home. A way of setting a place for a ghost." He paused, his voice softening further. "Tonight, that second bowl is for her. And for you." The fire crackled, spitting a spark onto the hearth. Annabel slowly, tentatively, reached for the bowl beside her. Her hands trembled, but she gripped the wood, drew it under the sackcloth, and began to eat. Each spoonful was a small, silent victory against the terror that had owned her for so long. She finished every last drop. That night, as Silas washed the bowls in a tin basin, she remained by the wall, knees drawn to her chest. But for the first time since he'd laid eyes on her, she wasn't shaking. She was just watching, a sentinel in the firelight, guarded and silent, but present. The ghost in the cave. The fire died to a bed of glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows that turned the log walls into a landscape of memory. Outside, the wind moaned through the pines, a lonely sound Silas knew well. He sat before the hearth, elbows on his knees, the warmth a poor substitute for the cold that lived deep in his bones. It had been 3 winters. A cold so profound it turned a man's breath to glass and his blood to sludge. He'd been greedy for timber, pushing north into Black Ridge, too proud to turn back when the storm hit. He remembered the sleep, the searing pain in his leg, the world tilting into a vortex of white. He'd fallen into a deep drift, the snow a suffocating blanket, and had given himself over to the quiet cold. But then, hands. Rough, sure, pulling him, dragging him over rock and ice into darkness. He awoke to a crackling fire in a small cave, hidden behind a curtain of frozen waterfall. The air smelled of something earthy and bitter, like boiled bark. Across the flames sat a figure, a woman, her face entirely hidden by a sackcloth tied neatly at the neck. Just like the one in the room behind him now. She wore layers of scavenged wool and leather, her movements precise as she tended the fire. When she spoke, her voice was the one he'd heard on the auction block, soft, measured, weary. "You don't need to know who I am," she had said. "But I won't let you die." She'd given him a bitter tea of pine bark and lichen, a remedy he later learned was used by the Cayuse to break fevers. She'd set his broken leg with splints and packed it with hot stones wrapped in cloth. He drifted in and out of consciousness, her voice a steady anchor in a sea of pain. When he finally woke to a cruel, blue morning light, she was gone. All that remained was the low fire end, placed neatly beside him, a small, folded square of cloth embroidered with uneven purple wildflowers. A token. He still carried it, tucked deep inside his coat pocket. He rose from the hearth and walked to the corner where Annabelle sat, still huddled. He knelt, not too close, and placed the small, embroidered cloth on the floor between them. He said nothing. She stared at it for a long time. Then, with hands that trembled violently, she reached out and untied the knot behind her neck. The sack slid free. Her face was not monstrous. It was human. But it was marked by a long, curved scar that ran from her right temple to her jaw, a pale, jagged line against her skin. It was an old wound, but its story was fresh. Her eyes, glassy but fierce, met his. "The man who ran the boarding house where I work," she began, her voice a raw whisper. "He wanted more than work. I said no." She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to her hands. "He came at me. I fought. I pushed him, and he fell. His head hit the iron stove." Her eyes flickered back to his, pleading. "He died. They said I lured him. Said I killed him for his money. No one would listen." She gestured to the scar. "This is what he gave me before he fell. They sold me to pay his debts, pass me along like livestock. The sack, they said it was to hide the face of a killer. I wore it so they would stop looking at me. So they would see nothing." Silas didn't move. He didn't offer pity or comfort. He simply looked at her, at the scar, at the story in her eyes, and saw not a killer, but a survivor. "3 winters ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "In a blizzard on Black Ridge. A woman with a voice like yours pulled me from a snowbank. She saved my life." He nodded toward the embroidered cloth. "She left this." Annabelle's breath hitched. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek, following the line of her scar. The secret was out, a shared memory that bound them tighter than any auctioneer's contract. The hunter and the shield a piece they'd carved from the wilderness was fragile as a fawn's leg. Trouble, when it came, rode a lean gelding under a sky bruised with storm clouds. The rider was a man called Cutter, a bounty hunter whose grey eyes missed nothing and forgave less. He was a human predator, known for his skill in tracking, skills some said he'd learned and twisted from a Blackfoot scout he'd once betrayed. Rumors of a scarred girl hiding with a North Ridge lumberman had drifted down the trail like thistle, and Cutter had caught the scent. He arrived at the logging post posing as a traveler looking for timber work, but his questions were too pointed, his gaze too sharp. Silas met him near the supply shed and knew him instantly. It wasn't the man's words, but the cold stillness in his posture, the lethal calm of a rattler before it strikes. That evening, Silas returned to the cabin, his face a grim mask. "He's hunting you," he said, the words falling like stones in the quiet room. Annabelle, stirring a pot over the hearth, didn't flinch. The fear was still there, a cold ember in her gut, but now it was forged with something else, resolve. She set down the spoon, crossed the room to the small chest at the foot of her cot, and pulled out the old burlap sack. It lay folded neatly, untouched since the day she'd shed it. She held it in her hands, the rough fabric a familiar weight. "I'll wear it again," she said, her voice low but steady. "You don't have to," Silas said, his own hands clenched into fists. Her eyes met his, clear and direct. "This time," she said, "it's not for shame. It's for strategy. It will be my shield, not my cage." They laid the plan by firelight, two minds working as one. Annabel would ride east at dawn, down the old fire road, the sack once more hiding her face. Cutter, seeing a lone, disgraced woman, would follow the easy prey. Meanwhile, Silas would take the high mountain pass, riding hard to fetch the sheriff from town and cut him off. It was a desperate gamble, a trap baited with Annabel's past. At first light, she mounted the second horse. The sack was tied over her head, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, but her hands on the reins were steady. She rode out, a ghost deliberately summoning its hunter. By sundown, Cutter had taken the bait. He trailed her deep into a rocky canyon, his focus so intent on his quarry that he never saw the trap close. Silas, the sheriff, and two deputized loggers emerged from the rocks, rifles leveled. Cutter went for his pistol, a fatal mistake. A single shot from the sheriff sent the gun spinning from his hand. He was bound and thrown over his own horse, charged with unlawful pursuit and attempted kidnapping. Annabel watched from a nearby ridge, a still, hooded figure. Only when Cutter was being led away did she ride down. Silas was waiting, his hand outstretched to help her from the saddle. She took it, sliding to the ground. Then, slowly, she reached up and untied the knot. The sack came free. She folded it once, then twice, her gaze fixed on the coarse fabric. "What will you do with it now?" Silas asked gently. She looked up from the sack, her gaze sweeping over the trees, the trail, and the man standing before her. A small, wry smile touched her lips. "I'll keep it," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Not as a memory of a prison, but as proof." "Proof of what?" "That even the thing that was meant to break you," she said, tucking the folded sack securely into her saddlebag, "can become the weapon you use to save yourself." The veil and the vow. Weeks later, a knock came at the cabin door. It wasn't the hard rap of a lawman or the urgent pound of trouble, but a slow, uncertain tap. Silas opened it to find a woman with kind, weary eyes and skin the color of rich earth. She held a worn hat in her hands, her dress stained with the red dust of a long road. "Name's Mavis Green," she said, her voice quiet. "I was kitchen help at the Ridley house." Annabel appeared in the doorway behind Silas, freezing at the sight of the woman. Mavis took a half step back, then held her ground. "I heard what happened. Figured it was time I stopped being a coward." Her eyes found Annabel's. "I saw it all that night. I heard you scream. I heard the crash. But I kept my mouth shut. I was scared. I needed the work." Annabel's fingers tightened on the doorframe, her knuckles white. "I ain't proud of it," Mavis continued, her voice thick with shame. "But I can make it right. If you let me." Over hot tea, Mavis recounted the truth, her words a balm on Annabel's oldest wound. With Silas's help, they wrote it all down, and Mavis signed the affidavit with a strong, steady hand. The letter was sealed and sent with a rider heading east. Weeks turned into a month. The forest awoke, dressing itself in the soft green of spring. One morning, the sheriff rode up, not with handcuffs, but with a single, sealed envelope. Silas read it on the porch, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in years. He handed it to Annabelle. The words were simple, official, and beautiful. Charges dropped. Case closed. Warrant rescinded. She read it 3 times, then walked out past the woodpile to the edge of the trees. She sank to the ground, laying her palm flat against the damp, mossy earth. She did not weep. She just breathed, a deep, shuddering inhale of air that was finally, truly free. Silas built the wedding arch himself from silvered pine, draping it with clean linen. Mavis came, as did the town blacksmith and his wife. They were not many, but they were enough. Inside the cabin, Annabelle stood before the small mirror. Her dress was plain cream muslin she had stitched herself. Over her hair, she placed a veil. Silas had taken the old burlap sack, washed it in the creek until it was soft, and sun-dried it until it smelled of wind and pine. He had trimmed the edges and, with careful, unpracticed hands, embroidered tiny purple wildflowers along the hem, a mirror of the token she had left for him in the snow. When she stepped outside, Silas was waiting under the arch. He saw the veil, the cloth that had once been her prison, now transformed into a symbol of her choosing. The scar on her cheek was visible through the thin fabric, no longer a mark of shame, but a line in the map of her survival. He took her hands in his. "It never mattered what was on your face," he said, his voice low and sure. "I only ever saw the woman underneath. The one who saved my life." Annabelle's smile was as bright and real as the morning sun. "And I see the man who gave it back to me." There was no priest, only the quiet witness of the trees and their friends. When they kissed, a soft breeze rustled the linen canopy. Later, as the stars began to prick the velvet sky, they sat on the porch steps. Annabelle held the veil in her lap, tracing the embroidered flowers. "This used to mean everything I feared," she said softly. Silas laced his fingers through hers. "And now?" She looked at him, her eyes full of a light that had finally banished the shadows. "Now," she said, "it means everything I chose." They sat in the quiet dark, their hands clasped together. In the heart of the wild, surrounded by a forest that had once been their refuge and their prison, Silas Boone and Annabelle Crow had found something more than survival. They had found a peace forged not by forgetting the past, but by reclaiming it, piece by painful piece, and turning it into a foundation strong enough to build a life upon.